the course aims to promote a conceptual framework. This is not a course that we pretend to take a how to do route. No. This is a course that is essentially, the main purpose is to provide a conceptual framework that can be challenged by you. It should be challenged by you based on your own experience. And this conceptual framework ties together the application of a nexus approach through sustainable development, peace, governance, and financing. So basically, we'll explore how these elements, these three pillars, let's say, create a sort of foundation for achieving durable peace in Africa by addressing the root cause of conflict and building systems that promote long-term resilience and stability. In a simpler way, we are trying in this module 1, we'd like for every and each participant to keep the idea that the only way to deliver durable peace is by delivering development. Everything else is band-aids. This is because why OSAA is promoting this narrative? Because in the past 4 years, OSAA has been creating, researching, writing a new narrative on Africa, but above all from Africa. So an African perspective of itself, So to do so, of course, we must start with an assessment of where we have come from. This is critical. From during the transition to the independence, and understand what type of states, governance systems, and societies we are engaged with. Each model, and as you will see, each model will introduce key aspects of this same conceptual framework. This is not a sum of models. This is the same conceptual framework that will try to deliver through 5 models, following a train of thought, and all of them linked to the same conceptual framework. Of course, the challenge that we'll discuss are placed within this framework, as I just said, to understand their socio-political, structure, and macroeconomic dimensions. So we go beyond the narrow perspective of some economic theories, trying to bring some political, economic, and political science dimensions to this debate. The course, this online training course, propose 2 assignments. And I would like to encourage all participants to complete these 2 assignments. The first assignment will be in Model 2, and will guide you on how to use data to better understand the triple paradox hindering Africa's development. And this is our 2023 report on Africa's development challenge. In that report, we say clear that Africa has been captured by a triple paradox: financing, energy, and food systems. And the first assignment is linked to this, let's say, this in Model 2, as I said, but linked to the triple paradox. The second assignment is in Model 4, and will consist of an essay that will build on the data exercise that I just mentioned to formulate a brief policy analysis and identify possible policy solutions to the challenge you have identified. Basically, in 23, we create this, let's say, conceptual framework, trying to understand why Africa has not delivered the MDGs, is off track on the SDGs. And we say in a clear way that Africa has been captured by this triple paradox. And now we are trying to, together, we'll be trying to to apply this triple paradox conceptual framework to each and African country. So more or less, this is the introduction that I'd like to provide first regarding the course. Now, let's move to our first webinar today. Today's webinar focuses specifically on the link, on the critical link between sustainable development and durable peace. And this is the core focus of Module 1. Again, and to better present Module 1, we have a very simple sentence. Durable peace requires sustainable development. Period. And in this model, basically, we emphasize that lasting peace cannot be achieved without addressing structural, economic, and social inequalities. And sustainable development lays the foundation for peace, as I have been saying. So, and we will be exploring how African states can leverage development as a tool for conflict prevention and resilience building. So basically, this session will also introduce how governance, finance, and institutional frameworks play a critical role on this peace and development nexus. Of course, one of the most important takeaways of Module 1 is the argument that the absence of the state is a primary root cause of instability and conflict in Africa. And as we'll see, our panelists, who are leading experts in the field, and thank you for being here with us, I will introduce you in a while, will provide critical and valuable insights into how these elements, again, governance, finance, and country systems, can be effectively tackled to create stable societies across Africa. So, having introduced the course, I would like now, with all my pleasure, to introduce our panelists. And allow me to start first by Victor Ochen. Victor, we have been working with you a couple of times, and there's been a real pleasure. Victor, thank you for our collaboration. Victor is the founder and executive director of the African Youth Initiative Network. He has dedicated his life to providing support to war survivors in East Africa and empowering youth through leadership and peace-building programs. His work has touched the lives of thousands, and he has been recognized globally for his efforts in promoting peace and development. Victor, it's a pleasure to be with you again in this conversation. Next, I would like to welcome Iman Karimo, a researcher specializing in conflict resolution and humanitarian action. Iman is currently a research associate with United Nations University, where she focuses on the youth, peace and security agenda, as well as multilateral response to transnational crime. She brings experience in policy analysis and governance in post-conflict settings. The third panelist, the last and third panelist, is Jait Martins Okeke, Regional Program Coordinator for Africa at United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Is Jid or Jait? Is connected?
It's actually Jide.
Jide. Jide leads initiatives focused on governance, conflict prevention, and inclusive development across Africa. He has also worked extensively with the African Union, ISS, CIPRI, and IPSS, all well international recognized bodies on peace, security, and development, and on peace support operations and democratic transitions. So this is our outstanding panel. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor, Iman, and Jide. I believe we can move, with your permission, we can move to the panel discussion. And as a moderator, allow me to introduce the first question. The first question. We would like to develop a conversation, as I said, around sustainable development and durable peace. So allow me to ask in a very simple way, and based on your experience, how can sustainable development initiatives address the root cause of conflict in Africa? Poverty, marginalization, inequity, grievance, etc. And to lay a foundation for lasting peace. Conceptual, everybody accepts the idea. I would say is an obvious idea. If it's so obvious, why has not learned from an implementation standpoint? What are the missing pieces in the conceptual framework, or what are the bottlenecks in the implementation, let's say, roadmap? And we can also maybe ask the question in the reverse order. How does the no delivery of development promote instability and conflict? The reason I'm adding this reverse order is because, and I will stop here, now the common sentence or the common statement is conflict is preventing development in Africa. I don't think this is the starting point. Today, maybe. But before conflict being a bottleneck today in terms of delivering development, in the past 30 years was just the opposite. The no delivery of development has led to conflict. And you need to go back to understand the starting point, so we designed policies that are appropriate. And the floor is open. With all my pleasure. I have two sub-questions. The first sub-question is to you, Victor. Are you ready?
Yes.
Yes. This is
yes, I'm ready.
Let me now address you your specific question. You, having grown in conflict-affected areas in the northern Uganda, how do you see sustainable development as a means to address the root cause of conflict, particularly poverty and social inclusion that everybody recognizes that in the past 33 decades have been feeding conflict in Africa? Back to you, Victor.
Thank you so much, Duarte, and thank you so much, everybody. I send you my warmest greetings from, I'm in Zimbabwe right now, at the border between Zambia, Zimbabwe. Let me welcome you to, I know this is important, but this is also part of nature. You can see next to me, I've got guests, the impala, the warthogs, the monkeys, they are all here. So this is what makes Africa. I thought I should just say that so that we can also walk away from our usually loaded diplomatic rooms to know that the nature exists. So yeah, a very good question that you ask about what does it mean to having been grown in the conflict zone? What does sustainable development look like to me? Let me say, I started witnessing conflict when I was a child. So it has been very noticeable from the very beginning that development was absent. And when I became a little bit older, in early 2000, at the point when the world was launching the Millennium Development Goals, it was such a phenomenal news that we could hear. But to just summarize that by saying that because of war, our generation missed out on Millennium Development Goals. because we are caught up in poverty, we are struggling to survive, we're living in conflict, we had no education, healthcare was zero, security was not operational at all. It was almost at a point when the health crisis was heavy in the society I was living in. So when SDG came about, the society became more informed that, yes, we missed out on Millennium Development Goal as a society, but now that Sustainable Development Goal has come, let us launch it in the community. So during the launch of SDG, at least I was able to work with my colleagues, and we launched, also at the request of the former Secretary General, to launch the Sustainable Development Goal in one of the signatory crime points where the Lord Resistance Army committed the heaviest massacre in northern Uganda. Intentionally, it was to mobilize the society to be part of the sustainable development because they had missed it during the Millennium Development. So the reason why we thought it was necessary was peace cannot be, sustainable peace would mean analyzing the social, political, and economic hardship of the society and understanding at best, in order to look deeper into what are the historical, what are the economic, what are the social drivers of conflict that we see in the community. Of course, from what we know, our insights have always revealed that sometimes we forget about economic triggers of the conflict, and then we focus more on social-political triggers of societal conflict. So in a way, we fail to incorporate whose peace are we talking about? Is it a peace for the government? Is it about statistics of how much conflict has reduced? Or is it about incorporating the livelihood, the day-to-day data, the livelihood, with emphasis on dignified housing, shelter, livelihood, and also look at the shortcomings and progress from top down or bottom up, with the ethos of basic necessity that society needs, that families need, that households are longing for in order to be able to afford and acquire education or to cater for their children with the basic healthcare support. So it comes down to learning. If we are able to learn or we are unable to learn this, it brings a greater gaps in terms of our response, in terms of our analysis of what development look like, and also what could be the diminishing economic, socio-political, economic goods that undermine the sustainable development in the society. Why I brought this one in particular is, let's say, for instance, right now, northern Uganda went into eras of peace, in eras of no conflict. But then when you talk to people, population whose family members probably were abducted and they have never come back, is 20 years plus. And we talk about families of child-aided children who can't afford to even still cater for themselves. So you could say, yes, war is over. Politically, we are quick to declare war is over. But when you look deeper, you find that war is not over. War has just changed the dynamics. It has moved from the battlefields into people's households. And who are the frontliners? They're the direct survivors. They're the individuals. They're the families. They're the women. They're the children. They're no longer the political fighting forces, maybe the militia from the government or from the rebel groups, but now it's now the people who are struggling with their day-to-day challenges at domestic and household level. So then comes into the generational transfer of trauma, of losses, of pain, because unless we are able to help children who have been through cognitive challenges understand what development look like, what peace will look like, they are not willing to be part of the process of a society. It also, lack of development undermines state legitimacy in the eyes of the citizens. And that is key in terms of moving forward. The moral bankruptcy of our political leadership is an essential drivers of conflict. If there is moral bankruptcy in that context, we have seen countries that has been through repeated recurrent conflict has fully struggled with political, only the basic political questions. So lack of that act of humility to say that let us address conflict by tackling development. But also, when you talk about resilience of the society, let me say this before I can move on to the next. State legitimacy or resilience, people always talk about individual resilience. and forget about creating an informed environment or an informed society where people should be able to articulate what governance, what democracy look like in that society. So the resilience of any humanity or any society goes beyond the individual resilience. Yes, people have gone through the worst of the worst. They have remained strong in the face of adversity. But is our democratic system resilient? If the democratic system is not resilient, we are not able to nurture an environment and era for peaceful political change, for democratic principle, for human rights, for accountability, then we're at a risk of saying individual resilience is insufficient of building a resilient society. And that is key for development.
Thank you very much, Victor, for such comprehensive and profound response. I will not comment, but allow me to move to Iman. And then before moving to question 2, we can just, I will summarize, and then we move to question 2. Iman, thank you for being here. It's really a pleasure. It's really a pleasure. In your research on the youth, peace, and security agenda, how can development initiatives be better designed to address the systemic inequalities that fuel conflict and instability in Africa? You can even question the question in the sense if it is a problem of policy design. Yes, just be open in addressing the question. Back to you, Iman.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to take part in this really important discussion. I think it's a great question, and you've already nailed my point, which is that it's a problem about how we design policies. But before I answer the how, I kind of want to answer the why I think we should focus on youth when it comes to the Peace and Development Nexus in Africa. So you've mentioned earlier USG Duarte. The nexus is well reported on, it's obvious, but what is the missing piece? What I would argue is that we often have not well identified and made enough investments into the key constituencies within the African demographic that will allow us to, get those outcomes that we want out of the Peace and Development Nexus. And I think that youth are the key constituency when it comes to this nexus in Africa. A lot of you already know that Africa has the youngest population in the world. About 70% of the sub-Saharan African population is under 3 years old, which has huge implications when it comes to the country's future, when it comes to investing in that workforce. So for a lot of policymakers, they would tend to be pessimistic about this. They will say, oh, that means there's more mouths to feed. That means there's unemployment issues. That means you have to sort of equip the society to deal with that youth bulge. But I would argue, in fact, it's a huge and unique opportunity. There's a real case for optimism. I think that's the first point that I want to make as to this key added advantage that the continent has of having such a huge bulge. Now, in terms of the link between the youth and instability on the continent, this is also very well reported. You have clear examples, for instance, in Nigeria, where we know that economic vulnerability of youth sustains political instability, that it fosters recruitment into violence, in this case, extremist violence with Boko Haram, etc. So the link is well reported, it's clear. And so that I think it's important first to make that point of why youth specifically are a key constituency to look at when you're talking about the Peace and Development Nexus in Africa. Now, when it comes to the how and the policy that we design, the first point I want to make is that I think what we don't do enough is to build on what already exists and to recognize that youth are at the forefront of development on a daily basis and of social justice in Africa already, that they are supporting, the elderly in post-conflict context, that they are standing up for justice, that they are protesting, that they are manifesting, that they are also at the forefront of sustainable development. They're building businesses in Africa every day. So having a thorough and accurate assessment of what is already being done, so that when you are trying to intervene, you are essentially trying to scale up, what's already being done is, I think, essential. So I think the policies that we are putting in place are, well-meaning, but they don't look enough at the local aspect, the local organizations, the local networks that constituencies have already built, and that you don't need to reinvent structures a lot of the time. What these people or constituencies need is recognition, they need support, they need the space to amplify the work that they're already doing. So there's real examples of that, I think, across the continent. If you look at Kenya, for example, you have youth that come up with digital platforms that promote civic engagement by providing tools where people can report corruption, for example. So that gives them really the power to participate actively in governance and in social accountability. And at the same time, because platforms like this are revenue inducing, that does really, it's a key and tangible example of the nexus. So I think that's basically my first point, which is that strengthening local initiatives and youth organizations, not creating entirely new programs, is really the path to sustainability and scale on the continent. I think my second point, when it comes to, and that's a little bit more the economic and development aspect of it, and of why, when you're trying to address root causes, when you're trying to address drivers of conflict, when it comes to, in this instance, youth, I think there's a big reflection to be had on how we frame economic inclusion and to go beyond job creation. So essentially, our baseline is to say, okay, we need to provide development, we need to provide economic opportunities, and the rationale is, if we do so, people will, be less inclined, youth specifically, to engage in violence. That's a tested and great rationale, but how do you provide economic inclusion? A lot of the times, the policies and the programs that we propose say, okay, we're just going to provide them with jobs. We're going to train them in XYZ jobs, and that will do, the effect out of its own. But what I see in my research is that it's not the case. It's too simplistic. So when I talk to youth, for example, what they'll tell me is we're constantly being trained for the same types of jobs. So you'll go into one community, you'll see that there's already, 20 hairdressers and 30 tailors. And yet the programs that we design are, will still train youth in those same jobs that are, or job market fields that are already oversaturated. What that means is it's great because you are trying to, be preventive and address, conflict drivers by allowing youth to participate and to be economically included. But then you need to think a bit more broader into how do you align your policies to broader national economic goals, right? That means that when you are designing policies and projects, you have to ask yourself, tangible questions like, what is the country's economic strategy? How does my punctual intervention support it, right? In order for these interventions to really be sustainable on the long run, in order for youth to, when they engage in those programs, they actually stick with it. Because if you don't do that, then it's a vicious cycle where
Yes.
I met youth that said, okay, great, we participated in this, UN-led program. They gave me a tailor machine, but I sold it to the markets, as soon as the program ended, because I'm not going to make money off of that. And then what do I do if somebody else, be it through illicit activity, suggests something to me that seems more lucrative, where I'm able to make more money, then I'm going to go into that. It's a very rational, human, behavior or standpoint. But then you are creating this vicious cycle where you're not able to have sustainable impact when it comes to the peace and development nexus. So all in all, I think a lot is being done. It might be well-intended, but there's really a key point in terms of rethinking, first of all, who do we deal with when we talk about the peace and development nexus? I argue that it's youth and women. Essentially, I haven't focused so much on women, but women are a key constituency where the return of investment is really very high in terms of peace and sustainable development. And then the how. How do you include them economically? What type of programs, development programs do you suggest to them? And how do you think about them more broadly and go beyond those type of punctual interventions?
So perhaps, Victor, I'm not sure if the USG has a connection issue, but perhaps we could go back to you a little bit and follow on for some of this conversation. And maybe in terms of what are the actions from your perspective that, have the most impact, let's say, in a community setting? I think you have, really emphasized the advocacy that I think you've been very effective on, but perhaps maybe we could hear a little bit from you while perhaps our USG just tries to reconnect.
Thank you so much, Jean. And you're right. It comes down to our actions and our inactions. I think for far too long, we are dealing with a society, generally Africa as a continent, we're dealing with a society that is quite torn apart based on historical accounts. And unfortunately, most of these misfortunes have never been treated with intent to properly heal. And sadly, I think many circumstances had difficult challenges in Africa problems have been kept manageable, not solved. There's been very limited, political commitment seeking to bring an end to problems. But as everything has been done to just keep the problems manageable for political purposes and all those things. And then when you look at the young generations of today, I think a young person will need to me, from what I have learned, like if you go to places which has been going through the historical conflicts, I think the difficult question is, how can I ask this young person to understand why should you not kill for what you don't know? People just kill because they want to participate in certain things because they know is the way to go. But if you can help them answer that question, ask that question, difficult question, why should I kill for what I don't know? And these are the reasons. And because the information that has been passed on has been very unsymbiotic, is not mutually benefiting. Year in, year out, people are waiting for change to come, but change has not happened. And also you find there's that fatigue of waiting, the long wait for real change, the long wait for, for sustainable development. And, when we are working with the young people today, the aspect of governance and accountability becomes a very difficult subject to talk about. You can't talk about it. If you're an NGO, they will come crushing you that you are anti-government, you are pro-Western. This is happening across the continent, not only in one country, but most of the countries in the continent are going through these challenges. So an aspect of accountability would actually be when people are willing to dialogue, engage, and meaningfully participate with intent to try to heal the wounds. Our historical injustice has not been properly addressed. So the nations, the countries, people are going through very untreated war wounds that has been there for far too long. So healing is key, but also passing on the right messages. We need to appreciate the agility, the dynamism that we see in our young generation. And, embrace that by telling them that, yes, we are not the first one to be part of this. We've been part of these processes, but there are people who came right before us. But what are we doing so differently today that we can learn from? And also, young people got to be made to understand the humility, the patience, the maturity that exists in our senior leadership, as opposed to saying, let us do a generational transfer of power. Let us work towards intergenerational co-leadership, where we're finding a way of working together. Because saying one generation at a time will not bring much change, which has been a problem in this continent so far. Majorities think that young people are too young to lead, they're too incompetent, they're too inexperienced to be part of the greater change. So we've been doing training, but right now, even mobilizing the continent, right? What leadership is necessary? The most important leadership that is needed in Africa is nurturing the young generation of African humanitarian leaders. Majority understand what it means to be in the humanitarian crisis, war to natural disasters. Now with climate change, every country is at the forefront of humanitarian emergencies. But who are going to be the one bringing this change? Let's bring on the young people, engaging them and building them the young humanitarian leadership spirit.
Thank you so much, Victor. And very good to have this perspective of intergenerational approaches. I'm not sure if the USG is connected again, but I should have gone to Jide. So Jide, let's hear from you first. We want to now reflect a little bit on the
Jean-Paul, I'm back.
You are
Sorry.
back, USG. I'm so
Yes,
sorry.
Yes.
I'm so
Sorry, you
sorry
have
then.
not seen my image. I don't know why, but my camera
Well,
was
it's
on.
because I was
Yes,
looking
my
at
camera was on.
my notes.
Yes,
Yeah, I'm
yes.
sorry.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. My apologies. I don't know what happened. Technology. My computer just went off. I hope it's not a bad signal in terms of new investments out of my pocket. I hope so. Sorry, I could not follow the last part of the conversation. Thank you, Jean-Paul, for jumping.
I was just
But
about to
before
hand
moving
over to Jide.
question 2,
Yes, exactly.
and I heard that Jean-Paul was commenting on the intergenerational dimension of the conversation. Allow me to just highlight 3 or 4 issues out of Victor's and Iman's intervention. By the way, thank you very much. You went straight to the point. Straight to the point. Victor raised a couple of issues that I would like to underscore. First, MDGs have not been delivered because conflict and instability. But then, from a formal standpoint, peace has been reestablished. And it says a very important concept that basically it seems that yes, from a formal standpoint, peace has been there, but another type of war has emerged with a different configuration, and this different type of war has behind economic triggers. Victor, thank you for this concept. Thank you. Because this is exactly the type of example that we need to position Nexus in a strong way. Then you say that when you bring the economic triggers to the conversation as driving a different type of war, you then bring education, learning, to use education to feed local communities with enough assets so they can be resilient economically, and the peace building, the stability building should be essentially a bottom-up process. If it's not, the war will just change jackets from a military war to an economic marginalization war. Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much for that insight. And when you did that, you brought a concept that is critical in our online training course, and we try to deliver in module 1, the resilience concept. We need to understand that we have been changing these development programs, MDGs, SDGs, NEPAD 2063, but we have been enabled to build resilience. When you don't build resilience, you are not ready to build development. Because every time comes an external shock, you go back to your starting point. Africa has not delivered resilience. We're supposed to deliver in the MDGs. So, allow me to use an expression that I've been used in closed door conversations. Africa has not implemented MDGs, has not built resilience. As African, allow me to intervene also as African in this conversation. I have the feeling that someone is asking me, as far as SDG implementation, to drive a car without tires. This is the feeling that I have. Because I have not built resilience before. Then comes democracy as a key element to build resilience, considering the ethnic composition and diversity composition of Africa, which is not a problem, is an asset. It becomes a problem when Africa becomes sometimes, or most of the times, an arena for external competition of resources. So then comes Iman with a brilliant intervention where she basically talked about why and how. And why I like the way you put it, Iman. Why youth? Why youth should be approached, seen, process as the key constituency as far as peace, security, and development. And you said it all. And you brought an important information that is in our 2023 Cause of Conflict report. In that report, we basically say, we address how unemployment in Africa has been driving conflict. And do you know what is the main conclusion of that report, Iman? That the most efficient job generator mechanism in Africa is you, the African youth. This is the main conclusion. 95%. Do you know that most of the employment in Africa is informal? Most. 85%. And out of these, 95% are youth employment in the informal sector. Who create this employment? State? Private sector? No. You, individual. Young Africans individual trying to, in their fight for, let's say, for survival. Then you beautifully come with how to do it. And you brought something that is very important and is related to the bottom up. Do not reinvent the wheel. And you said what I have been saying using different words. I love to use my words, Iman. I have been saying, please stop treating Africa as an empty space. Please. We have structures. The last report, the 2024 report that deals with the rule of law, justice systems, and human rights, this is the main message. Don't treat Africa as an empty space. We have been having our own structures for justice, for rule of law, human rights in the past 200 years. And they have been there, and they're still there. So when designing policies, don't treat Africa as an empty space. And in fact, these touch your arguments and your example of policy design. You gave an example how a policy has been badly designed. Why? Because most of the policy making in Africa, when conceptualizing and designing, their starting point that Africa is an empty space, has nothing. So we start importing Western models to solve our own problems. And then comes to your example. You are training dozens of tailors, let's say in this way. And what they do? They sell the tailor machine. This is not a problem of the own. The policy has been badly designed. Why? No data. No data. You reach a point in Africa that you cannot process design policy making without data. And I finish here. I need to move. GDE, exactly. I need to move to GDE, yes. But I need to move to question 2, because GDE is in question 2. You know, I'm following my guidelines. I'm a very, from my staff. So GDE, are you with us? I don't see GDE, sorry. Is connected?
Yes, USG.
GDE, yes. Can
Yes.
you just open the camera so I can see you? And gentle, open and close it. Yes, just to greet you. Then, yes, I know that you are having connectivity problems. So let's go quickly to second question. What role do governance and institutional frameworks play in linking development and peace? I would like, this is a key question. What role do governance and institutional frameworks play in linking development and peace? And how can African governments and multilateral institutions strengthen these frameworks to create stability and prevent conflict? This is, let's say, the main question. And I will address to you, GDE, the sub-question 1. You have, I'm sorry, you have extensive experience working with UNDP and the African Union. So in your view, what are the key institutional reforms needed to connect governance, development, peace, security in fragile states? This question has a very clear intention, GDE. is to bring to this conversation about development, peace, security, and development. But when putting development in the equation, we need to go beyond physical infrastructure, bridges, roads. No. We need to bring the institutional dimension. We need to bring intangible assets to this conversation. Back to you, Jide.
Thank you very much, USG Duarte, and good afternoon to colleagues. I am actually speaking from Mekelle in northern Ethiopia, where I am conducting a field mission. I think the first point to make is that congratulations. This is an important conversation, and I hope that we can maintain the momentum. USG Duarte, you had mentioned that the first question or the first challenge is to change mindset. I think in thinking about institutional reforms, the fundamental question to try and address is, where is this reform coming from? Is it coming from a bunch of panel of experts, as we often try to establish? Or is it coming from consultancy companies that we pay to do reforms? I think increasingly, if we do want to change mindset, it is now time for reforms to be informed by the voices of the citizens that institutions are supposed to serve. And I think the previous panelists have actually tried to articulate that argument. So I think that is the first consensus that is coming out of this training, that if reforms and change or transformation must be informed by the voices of the citizens that these institutions are expected to serve. And we have been thinking about this within the context of two fundamental insecurity issues on the African continent. The first is the prevalence of violent extremism in West and Central Africa, and the second is around the resurgence of military coups over the last 4 years, where we have seen at least 8 successful military coups, again, primarily in West and Central Africa. We decided to ask respondents and citizens why this phenomena exists. Within the context of violent extremism groups, we interviewed 2,000 respondents who were previous members of violent extremist organizations. So why did you join a violent extremist group? And 25% of those that we had interviewed did say that they joined these groups largely because of employment opportunities. And this is a fundamental point that points to the economics of instability, especially in some of the countries that we have interrogated. Others mentioned points like the social economic context. 21% of those we interviewed joined violent extremist groups because of friends and family. And I can go on and on. But it's important that this is really increasingly shaping how we do institutional reform and policy changes on the ground. In relation to the resurgence of military coups, we interviewed 8,000 citizens across 8 countries. Mm-hmm. And their responses was quite profound. Amongst those that we interviewed, over 67% of those did say that it was largely because of the abuse of democracy. That is why there was this short-term euphoria about military coups. So democracy overall is still very popular on the African continent. But what we are seeing on the African continent is less patience for the persistent abuse of democracy. And it's an important point to make, because when democracy no longer serves or provides the basic social contract between the state and citizens, it becomes very problematic, and it creates the vulnerabilities that we are seeing that increasingly could lead to, of course, of various forms of insecurity, including military coups. And there were other points around lack of inclusion. We have talked about that here. We've talked about persistent insecurity. Most of the countries where we have seen military coups are countries that have experienced persistent insecurity for at least 10 years, with the exception, of course, of Gabon. And so the question for us is, what do we do about this as we think about institutional reform, as we think about the nexus, as we think about development? Mm-hmm. How can these voices shape, or citizens' voices shape reforms, and how can they help transform societies? I think I would just want to stress 3 points before I close my remarks. The first is that we need to begin to invest proportionately in how we do humanitarian assistance vis-a-vis how we do development assistance. I think if you look at how much we do spend in terms of, you do a comparative analysis between humanitarian financing and development financing vis-a-vis spending on preventing violent extremism, humanitarian financing is still at 31%, whilst funding that goes towards violent extremism is less than 2%. So you already see this disproportionate investment that leads to almost a permanent complex emergency. And it is certainly not the right approach in terms of the policy that we are beginning to espouse. Now, the second point I want to make is, how do you support transitions? Today, we are saying that there has been an election in Chad, so essentially the transition in Chad is over. That's a very wrong approach. We need to accompany Chad in a way that we can build resilience. USG Duarte mentioned that point. By saying that the transition is over means that we are missing out on opportunities that would build resilience. And that is why with the African Union, we established this Africa Facility to Support Inclusive Transition. I don't need to go into the details here, but it's an important programmatic offer. And lastly, I have not seen any successful female coup plotter, a military coup plotter yet. And I think it's an important point. It's an evidence to demonstrate that by including women in political processes, by including more women in deciding around security institutions, we are de-risking vulnerabilities. So the evidence is abundant around inclusion. If we do include women and young people in political processes, perhaps we can begin to see some degree of stability emerge. I'll stop there and back to you, USG.
Thank you very much, Jide. Very also pertinent issues. Allow me to move to the sub-question 2 and the question 2. And we'll just promote a sort of takeaway before moving to question 3. Sub-question 2, I would like to address it to Iman. Are you ready, Iman? So Iman, from your perspective, as a researcher working with multilateral institutions, how can African governments strengthen their governance frameworks to better support sustainable development and peace? And we go back to that very useful example, simple one, but very useful example that you provide under question 1. Back to you, Iman.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think Jide mentioned a lot of keywords: social contract, resilience, inclusion, that I want to go into detail a little bit more as well, maybe slightly from a different standpoint. I think it's very clear that, African governments have a unique opportunity, especially, nowadays, to sort of rethink their governance frameworks. And I think it's interesting because it's a paradox that conflict is sort of a moment, an unwanted but a unique opportunity to re-examine, resilient structures that already exist within African societies. And I think that makes me want to go into a concept that you sort of touched upon a little bit earlier, which is the one of hybrid governance on the continent. So I think it's important to distinguish between sort of national and local level governance. When you look at national governance in Africa, and Jide mentioned already, issues that we have around democratic leadership, issues that we have around bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption, resource management, the picture looks very pessimistic and grim. But when you start looking at local level governance, there is a real case for optimism there, because that's really the level at which you see resilient African societies and the types of practices that have, endured years after years, generation after generation, when it comes to governance and governance frameworks. So I want to give a bit of a personal example that comes from my community in northern Benin. close to the Niger border, where, you know, customary leadership is really huge. You have traditional chiefs that enjoy, you know, a very strong level of local legitimacy. They're sort of ruled by customary law, which is sort of the de facto governance system. And really, you know, this is like their ability to sustain customary law is a huge, you know, factor of why certain communities or these communities are able to be stable. Now, that doesn't mean that the picture is perfect, because often, you know, that customary law isn't so much inclusive, right? So if I take the example of land rights, for example, women are often at the losing end of land rights, where they're not able to inherit land, they're not able to exploit land. So what's interesting in a country like Benin is you have an ongoing process where the state is trying to, you know, figure out a way and answer these questions of how do we make space for local customs and at the same time have a certain level of law enforcement that ensures equitable access to resources for all. So that's what, you know, I sort of call hybrid governance, which is that interesting concept where you're trying to build a bridge between traditional customs and authorities, and at the same time, you know, have a certain level of state structures that provide oversight and that could enable inclusive and resilient governance. That sort of allows me to answer the question a bit more directly, to make the point of, you know, how can we have, you know, how can we reform those governance structures? I think the first point is, again, inclusivity, but so then inclusivity, not just in terms of who you are including in decision making and the constituencies that I mentioned earlier, so youth, women, but inclusivity in terms of perspectives. And that's why I mentioned traditions and customs, right? So, you know, that's also, I think, a point that's mentioned in the course is this idea that the reason why we lack legitimacy in governance in Africa is because it is a replica of, you know, colonial administrative Westphalian states that have been imposed, you know, from the top down. If you want to reverse you know, the trend, and if you want to build bottom-up approaches, you're going to have to look at what seems legitimate to people. What is their customs? What have they been doing? What is their, you know, their definition of a social contract? What is their interpretation of a social contract? And how are you able to build a bridge between both? How you're able to have hybrid governance systems in Africa? I think there are real examples on the continent that already exist. If you look at Rwanda, for example, they have this system that's called, I'm probably going to mispronounce it in case anyone is from Rwanda in this, in the webinar, it's called the Imihigo performance contract system, which is a really interesting model by which, that is essentially a pre-colonial model that holds local leaders accountable for their promise to the community, right? And the Rwandan government came up with that at some point where they were trying to, you know, promote the national development agenda, but they said we need to find a way to anchor it locally in a way that, you know, it will garner local ownership. And, you know, it's no secret to anyone, Rwanda's sort of economic growth in the past years, and that is one of the key factors as to why they were able to do this. So to summarize, it's inclusivity in terms of not just constituencies, so who you're trying to include, but really perspectives, traditions, customs. I think being able to embed, you know, governance in those sort of pre-colonial systems is really important in Africa. Another key aspect of, you know, reforming governance structures is the discussions around decentralization, but also flexibility. It's always based on the same idea that we have to make with the type of countries we have today. I mean, we have inherited borders, which means we have countries where you have, you know, coexistence of so many different cultures, so many different ways of seeing things. That will require, more than any other, you know, maybe Western state, a certain level of flexibility and decentralization. That means that you have to deal with people who don't always necessarily see things the same way. So you have to adapt your governance system to that. You have to be able to delegate. You have to be able to make people, you know, deal with political leaderships as locally as they can, right? You have to go to them versus the inverse. So it's, again, the same idea, but always trying to see it from a different standpoint. My last point, talking about social contract, is accountability. it is impossible to have a social contract without accountability.
Exactly.
And that is what we don't have enough of on the continent. You can put in place any mechanism you want, but if people don't have a sense that you are accountable to them and that there are mutual, responsibilities and duties, it will bring you nowhere. I think, again, just to cite an example that already exists on the continent, as I was doing research, I looked at Liberia, for example, that have what they call the County Social Development Fund. That is a fund that mandates that any revenue from the extractive industry has to be managed by local authorities, and they are required to report on the spending to their community members. And so the idea is you need a mutual accountability system. People need to feel like, you are accountable to them as much as they are accountable to you. There's other examples, for example, working more on the youth, peace and security agenda. I looked at Chad, where there's some really interesting things that are being done within to sort of challenge those social norms around intergenerational dialogue, as we were talking about earlier, where in one community that has seen growing youth bulge because of IDPs coming in from different countries, they put in place what they called an intergenerational charter, which is literally like writing a mini constitution at the community level of what the elders are accountable to youth, but also what youth are accountable to the elders. And so these kind of interventions that really, sustainably deal with rebuilding, in fact, or maybe building, it kind of depends on how you want to see it, but those social contracts in an inclusive manner, in a flexible manner, in a manner that really, is sort of aligned with people's day-to-day reality and with people's cultures is really key. Like, it's not easy because we haven't inherited those structures, but it's really overcoming, as you said, our mindsets, right? Of who are we and how do we build, political systems that look more like us, essentially.
Exactly. Iman, thank you very much. Thank you. Again, another outstanding conversation and question too. Jide, you start by raising, in my opinion, a quite critical issue: institutional reforms. I think we need to challenge. I need to question how we have been approached institutional reforms in Africa. My sense, based on my experience as being Minister of Finance of Plan in Cape Verde for 10 years, that the institutional reforms has been almost perceived or transformed in a huge market of consulting companies. And I'm being very open as usual. And that approach does not deliver organic change. It doesn't. It doesn't deliver organic change. It took me more than 6 years to do a couple of reforms on the public finance management in Cape Verde. Not 6 months, not 1 year, 6 years, not to say 10. So, and I do believe that as far as institutional reforms to create, as Iman said, the right governance frameworks. So, when you say right governance frameworks, Iman, are those governance frameworks that basically create a space for African actors to take over and exercise ownership. Because it's the only way that we can factor in, as you said, pre-colonial structures, dimensions, rules, and let's say customs. Then you move to another issue, is the unconstitutional change of political regimes in Africa. And Jide, you link that with the fact that democracy is not delivering. This is the way to understand this unconstitutional change of political regimes. Not just look at and come up with sanctions. We need to understand the root cause of that. And I was quite impressed with the number that you brought to the conversation, Jide. 67% of the survey organized by UNDP mention abuse of democracy. Sorry, this is a concept that doesn't exist. If abuse of democracy, with all my due respect, is no democracy. So we cannot create gray areas. We cannot create democracy and accept within democracy that are abusive situations. No. From the moment abusive situations start emerging, we stop having democracy. Democracy is a very simple concept. And I like very much how you challenge allocation of resources between development and humanitarian. Yes, thank you very much. Then we move to Iman, and I'm bringing this idea so we can fit question 3 very. Iman, I start by inviting you to our UN African conference on December about rule of the law, justice systems, and human rights. The main idea out of that conference, again, as far as these 3 dimensions, justice, rule of the law, human rights, Africa is not an empty state, is not an empty space. And you have been advocating to create space to customary law to address challenge. And I like your concept of hybrid governance. This is the concept that OSAA brought to social protection in Africa. Exactly. Social protection is the example where people has been assuming Africa as an empty space, which is not true at all. It belongs to our DNA, to our culture. And we need to create an hybrid social protection system, factoring pre-colonial practice of social protection. Then you mentioned, and I will stop here, our geographic challenges. We create a narrative that there are 3 geographies in Africa that have been in a silent way. I believe I wrote an op-ed on that. I will send to you. There are 3 geographies in Africa that in a silent way have been feeding instability. One of them is the geography out of the Conference of Berlin. Yes, because you cut Africa, basically. The second geography is the ethnic culture groups geography. We have one ethnic group that starts in Gambia and finishes in Cameroon. As simple as that. And the third one, which is more a post-independence geography, is the post-independent states geography, where the state essentially covers the capital and something else, leaving untapped the most territory. And these 3 geographies have been indeed, we are completely aligned in feeding conflict and instability. So with your permission, I need to move to question 3. And question 3 is, how can youth leadership, grassroots peace building efforts be integrated into sustainable development strategies to create more resilient and inclusive society in post-conflict African states? And the first question goes to Victor. Victor, given your work with youth in conflict zones, what strategies can be employed to better integrate youth leadership into national development and peace building process? Take account the time. I'd like if you can be concise. My apologies. Back to you.
Thank you so much, USG. And I think, first of all, let's understand the nature of conflict has also evolved over time. It's no longer the usual conflict we talked about. My brother, Badi, talked about the military coups in the continent. And if we ask ourselves, who are these coup leaders? Is any of us in touch with them? Who among us has ever spoken to them even before they became coup leaders? So that leaves a very open ground, you know. These are not young people who are not part of the continental movement on civil society, human rights, democracy, things like that. They were not part of that. So we should expect even more difficult days ahead in terms of who we are celebrating as coup leaders today. And of course, As I said, the nature of conflict has become very evolved and becoming even more complex and fragmented. And what we are seeing today, for example, is a number of armed factions are no longer only in the bushes, but also now they're even being programmed at home in our sitting rooms, on our cell phones. Young people are taking leadership in this kind of situation. And the fragmentation, along with all these conflicts spreading across within the urban settings, within our communities, and intertwining with our historically different, difficult, and environment of consolidation, where interethnic tension has been so strong, and economically there's a bigger divide between the rich and the poor, and also we're looking more into the military issues, even making the dispute becoming more prolonged and more difficult to find a solution using the traditional mediation way. So, and remember, we talk about young people. These are young people who may not appreciate so much dialogue, because they have seen that dialogue has not worked previously. And they have seen that mediation effort has not brought like permanent end to the solution. So they're looking for a change now. And for them, they don't want to wait until tomorrow or the next year. They're saying we want change where the Gen Z, if we say the president must go, he must go. When does he go? Immediately. So these are the kind of narrative that we are seeing in the community. And then lastly, let us also, as I said, upon analyzing the economic challenges and looking more into what power exists at the grassroots level, what power exists within our churches, within our cultural institutions, what a community or community-centric peace-building process are we adapting and are we passing to the young generation? There's a disconnect between that. We need a bridge-building, a peace-building initiatives, where today we're seeing so many military drills happening around the world. Even our own countries are going through military drills. They're planning for the next war. Probably we are closer to another world war than we have ever been in a long time. So, and the question is, who are going to be the fighters? Who are the majority of the frontliners? They're the young people. So it comes down to the three things I'm looking forward to. One of them is, are we mobilizing a generation that is confident enough to believe that the Africa they want is in Africa they own? And how can they own that Africa? It's not about giving them the Africa they should get. It should be about Africa they own, the one they can protect, the one they can defend, and the one they can, promote in one way or another. That is one. And then secondly, in the depth of all these crises, we need to pursue development and unite the divided country. People are so divided. Even having more resources today is almost a reason for insecurity on you, because majority are poor and you are the minority few who are wealthy and who are being accused or looked at it in a different way. It becomes so difficult to even appreciate that. And then lastly, we need to, of course, we talked about women. Empowering women is important. We need to make sure that girls and women are part of the driving force in peace and development. I learned this from my mom. I learned this a lot from during the hallmark of the conflict. You could see that women demonstrated more strength on the face of adversity during and after the conflict. Yes. So a woman is like a garden where we plant trees, we plant seeds to grow. If you can use the women network, women's strength to plant the culture of peace in our children right at the early age, the cognitive power of children growing to appreciate who they are, their Africanity, their humanity will be something that will help that child to become a player in building a road to inclusive development in Africa. That comes down to the women participation, the significant, meaningful women participation. If they're not included in the growth process, it becomes very difficult to remove the barriers of division, to remove the barriers of hatred and all these kind of things. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's very important that young people can drive change, but they need to be engaged at the right time, with the right tools, with the right intentions. That is
indeed, Vic. Thank you very much. And I move quickly to Iman, the last question before opening the floor. Iman, how do you see the role of youth-driven policy in achieving long-term development outcomes? How can multilateral institutions support these youth-focused initiatives? Please be concise and crispy. Back to you.
I'll be very concise. I just want to make one small point on something that Victor said I think is important on the sorry, ever-evolving nature of war. I think our sort of a basic understanding we need to have nowadays is that war becomes more difficult to justify for young Africans today because of what they see, the level of development that they see elsewhere in the world. You know, you have social media, you have, you know, an outlook onto what's going on in the world. So it's only natural in terms of internal societal processes that you will see that growing frustration, that you see those protest movements, because there's no reason for why, you know, American youth can lead, you know, enjoy a certain level of development, and youth in Congo or elsewhere in the continent couldn't. So that's just a good point, I think, to make about why they react the way they do in terms of their needs for development. Now, focusing back more on youth-driven policies, as you said, I think it's a really important question to make it concise and crispy, because I think I've already explained a bit earlier why you need those youth-driven policies. Now, in terms of what you should do better, I think one is investing in youth capacities and youth skills. Across the continent, the different types of youth organizations that I've been able to talk to, what they say is, don't tell us what to do, equip us with what we need to do what we do better. So one is knowledge, education, skills, sometimes in even things like conflict analysis, mediation, and conflict resolution. So you might have the tools, you know your community better than anyone else. You know the social dynamics in your community. You know why there's farmer-herder conflicts. You know why there's inter-community conflicts. But you need, you know, almost like academic or sociological tools to be able to put that into words and to design, for instance, a conflict mediation or conflict management strategy. So that's one thing. And I think the reason why that's really important to understand why that's an actual strategic investment is that what you are doing in terms of sustainable, you know, development and sustainable peace is you're investing in a generation that is equipped with dealing with, you know, conflict and preventing conflict. So you're actively, you know, shaping them and shaping their response to even future conflict. That's one thing. Second thing is the nature of the funding that you're providing. So because, you know, I think it's clear from this webinar, from the course, that the idea that you cannot have political inclusion without economic inclusion, but when you try to do economic inclusion, how do you do it? I mentioned earlier the idea of linking it to national economic strategies, but I think it's also the nature of the funding that you're providing. So the ability to have flexible funding is really important. You know, when they deal with big bureaucracies, be it at the national level or international level, like multilateral organizations like the UN, like the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund, for example, you know, the administrative hurdles and the processes and the red tape that is involved is insane. And what that means is you are, you know, you are antagonizing like young people who don't yet have the skills to respond to your bureaucratic standards or expectations. You need micro grants, you need seed funding, and often that is where you see the most, the biggest return of investments, right? When you're able to have small, you don't need a lot of funds essentially. When you're able to have small investment in local-led, youth-led initiatives, that's where you see a lot of the big impact. I was going to go into details, but I guess I'm just going to skip that and go to my last point, which is supporting youth networks and youth resilience. So the idea is that, you know, numbers is key, and the more young people are able to work with each other as well and to collaborate, the better their impact. And so as much as possible, I think, you know, policies haven't enough trying to invest in youth networks as a whole versus working with maybe one single, you know, organization that sort of has all the attention, and not so much like fostering collaborative frameworks. I'm going to stop there. I had some more ideas, but
thank you very much. We close here let's say the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Gida, Victor, and Iman. Before opening the floor, thank you for raising an important concept, economic inclusion. And I will just make a short comment. We need to recognize the rule of the game of the economic system that we belong to. It exists, is outside, and it has its own rules. And believe me, we cannot change those rules during our generation. But we need to increase our awareness of those rules so we play better the game. In terms of women, economic inclusion means to create the right policies, tools, space to make every and each African woman a owner of assets. Assets is the only way that you can help women, support women, drive economic inclusion. If a microcredit line does not deliver, does not transform that woman in an owner of assets, that microcredit has failed. Because it has not put that woman in a sustainable and expansion economic path, just perpetuating her situation. Having said that, let's move. We have only 20 minutes for our question and answers. I have been told that the UN Staff College, because we are delivering this together with the UN Staff College and also the Peace and Security, the Peace and Development Trust Fund, but the UN Staff College will help me in terms of question and answers.
Yes, that is correct.
That is, thank you. Thank you very much. So the panelists are ready to receive questions. Do we have questions in the chat or
yes,
other?
we have several questions in the chat, and then we also have already two hands raised in the room. And
Let's
three
start
hands
for the
raised.
raised hands. Is that possible?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first raised hand was Peter Quest.
Thank you so much. My name is Peter Quest, head of youth program.
Peter, I forgot to tell you, you have 1 minute for your question.
Yes.
Okay.
That is okay. So my name is Peter Quest from Kenya School of Government. Remember, Kenya has gone through a lot of phases of GNZ versus the current government. And that has costed a lot of jitter in terms of development and peace stability. So the question that I want to raise is that I think when we look at this concept of peace and security, what is very critical here is that there has to be a deliberate effort, and that's what I want panelists to bring on board, that it's not really politics. Youth don't really want to go to politics, but they are more emphasizing on the trust of government in place. So that if there's trust and there's a deliberate trust and direct investments, and I like what Imani says, and of course what Victor has also said, that youth don't want to go to politics, but the politicians have made it mandatory that the youth must really engage in politics. So how do we demystify these narratives and have a little bit of focus on development rather than on politics and politicking? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Would like to take very quickly this question? Iman, 1
minute, I'll take it.
Yes.
Sorry. Sorry, Victor, did you want to intervene? Oh, okay. I'll take it very quickly. I don't know. I agree with you in terms of, let's say, the wide range of aspirations that youth might have. So it's not just politics. It might include politics, but in fact, it's much more than that. At this point, it's also just basic social service delivery. But one key, I think, word in terms of when you look at the Kenyan situation is like accountability. I think that's what's really key, and something that we've talked about in the webinar is Kenyan's youth population has said, you cannot manage public funds without our say. There needs to be accountability in terms of what the government that has been elected by the people is doing, how to manage basically, social affairs and government affairs. And so I think that's how it fits into our conversation, is that youth in Africa, being such a huge constituency within those country contexts, are the sort of key accountability mechanism where they will go to the street if you're not delivering the way you're supposed to. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's move to the next one, please.
That would be Sara Fornabayo.
Yes, Sarah, correct? Did I understand the name?
Thank you. And
Sarah?
can you hear me?
Yes, 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you for this insightful discussion. I work in a United Nations agency, which is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And I mean, so, I really admire people like Victor and Iman that support communities, real communities. My work is more indirect. And this is where my question comes. So we try to embed, let's say, vision from the African countries into our staff. So we try to have a diverse staff that can bring different perspectives. I really like the argument about perspective that Iman made. But my question is that enough to shape our interventions according to what is really needed on the ground? Because my feeling is that there's also sort of casta, I would say, of international offices that grow. I mean, even if they come from the concerned countries, they grow in a sort of bubble, like a diplomatic or very high level sphere. And so, I mean, probably they also lose the sense of what is really needed on the ground. So also the projects that come out from those experts are not that sounded as they should. So we try to adopt a community approach. We have the Farmers Forum, the Indigenous People Forum, we have youth constituency.
Sarah, you need to be concise.
No, so
your question is very clear. Let me give the opportunity to Victor. Victor, a tough question. I want an outsider to respond. This is the reason I'm not calling Gide. This is the reason I'm not calling Gide. I'm calling you, Victor.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the question. Actually, when you talk about agriculture, you are touching the core of the life where the majority are, where the majority of young people, because we know in Africa, for instance, the larger population are the so-called unskilled youth. These are people dropped out of school before attaining any qualifications, but they're repairing our vehicles in our garage, in their garages. When we people from UN take our vehicle, they're repaired by those unskilled, uneducated youth, and we don't recognize them. Secondly, followed by the semi-skilled, those who have been through schools, they learned a lot, but they have never been able to get formal jobs, and they are the second largest majority. So the question is, where is the opportunity to create a larger labor market for the semi-skilled and unskilled youth? It is agriculture. It is that sector. That's the most productive sectors of the society. But our problem has been innovations and support and financing around and about technology. It's not, to a greater extent, it's less about agriculture. Yet that's an opportunity to employ the largest population, the workforce in the society, the largest labor market we can create for the semi-skilled and unskilled youth in the community. And right now we're having humanitarian emergencies, food crisis all over. How much are we innovating to make sure that we help these young people transform their trauma, their pain, their suffering into an opportunity to innovate around how do we support the local humanitarian leadership from Africa and making sure the young people are at the forefront of driving this humanitarian response. We can't be like other parts of the world where humanitarian response has been very Eurocentric, has been very superpower oriented, but we are saying, can we adapt and say that we don't need to wait for Geneva to say yes. If an emergency is happening in my neighboring communities of Congo, we can step in as Africans and respond in time and with urgency.
Victor, the same way we say durable peace requires sustainable development, we can also say humanitarian intervention can only be effective if they deliver sustainable development. Exactly. Otherwise, is an intervention to keep a business model.
And
next
for
question,
us,
please.
We don't even need flags in our humanitarian package. We can just deliver.
Exactly, Victor. Next question. Maybe now you can go to the chat. Someone help me with the first question from the chat.
My colleague Umaima has been checking the chat. So please,
yes.
Umaima.
Yes, we have a number of questions in the chat. I'll go with this one. Why is it that increasingly the leaders and elite in Africa are predatory with no grounded strategies or will to provide developmental leadership? Could it be the democracy which insists on limited terms in office?
Would like to respond?
I can take
Jide?
that too. That
Victor, okay.
I can take that and say, unfortunately, most of our leaders have been caught in this wave of politics of poverty. Keep people poor for easy manipulation. If you give a poor youth $1, they will worship you because they have nothing. And then that's easy to manipulate. And you look around the development in the continent, like we talked about earlier on, it's such an extended family governance, not extended country governance. You know, you find a president comes to power and surrounds himself with incompetent family tribal members who in most cases fail to deliver according to the laws of the land, the constitution. So in a way, we are using poverty as a very important tool for keeping the governance or keeping people under control.
And just to jump in real quick, I think there's external reasons and external reasons for our type of government, or for why sort of poor governance is sustained the way it is on the continent, right? Exactly. I think it's important to be nuanced when you think of it. Like, yes, unfortunately, you know, we have physical leaders that don't always make choices that are, you know, to the benefit of the most. But I think it's also important to understand that they are operating within a broader multilateral system where a lot of the multilateral institutions that Africa has to deal with today haven't been put in place with Africa in mind, haven't been put in place with the well-being of Africans in mind, and that sustain maybe you know, those type of poor governance that we have, it's almost to a certain degree provides an incentive for those to be sustained. So it's like, it's always you know, it's an equilibrium between what happens on the inside, but what also sustains it from the outside. I think it's important to see it from both standpoints.
Yes. Let's move to the next question in the chat again.
There's actually a direct question for Iman that says, Iman indicated that there is a tendency to saturate youth with the same skills. Does that mean needs analysis is lacking? How does youth get involved to determine their needs?
Yeah, I think Yosi Duarte answered that earlier a bit in the webinar when she mentioned the data gap. There is a huge data gap on the African continent, particularly when it comes to youth. So we design programs that are effectively based on not much. So not a lot of the ground realities of what happens. So yes, there is a clear need for more data to be able to have more accurate needs analysis. At the same time, a good way and a simple way to mitigate that, and that answers also a question that came up beforehand, is consultative processes. So before you design a policy, consult the actual people that, you know, the policy is going to affect, and beyond consultation, you know, include them in the design of the policy. That's the only way to make sure that it somehow can be sustainable. But that requires a certain level of flexibility in terms of approach and mindset from your standpoint. So you might have thought about it in a certain way, but once you go into it and into the details, you realize you're going to have to shift things very differently. That's something that bureaucracies are not very good at doing, including at the UN. I think we have a hard time going beyond, you know, set mindsets and frameworks.
Next question, can we take a raised hand?
Sure. Ambassador Karim Sumana, please.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Iman, Victor, Jide, and USG Duarte. And thank you for the UN Staff College for organizing this. I think that I might go. I do agree with everything that was said in the class, and I think it was very informative and great. But I want to go beyond certain terms. For example, when people say resilience, I am against resilience, because for me, I don't think we should ask the youth to basically, when I hear resilience, I hear PTSD. And I don't think that, you know, we should ask the youth, our youth, to constantly be resilient, because when you go to other countries, when you go to developed nations, those kids are not asked to be resilient. They just asked to live, to learn, and then to enjoy the fruits of development. Also, I think that we need to redefine the term of Africa. I think that we all love the continent. We all love this concept of Pan-Africanism, of how great it is. But in practical term, what does it mean? Are we one block, or are we just more than 50 nations that each have their particularities? And one thing that I didn't hear through this discussion is nation building. I think that should be the focus for sustainable development to work. We have to have nations. If you don't have nations, how can you basically talk on the continental level? And the third thing that I have a very hard time with is the term humanitarian. And I realized that when I was back in the capital working with him, we have transformed the countries into humanitarian states. And a humanitarian state cannot encourage sustainable development, nor can it encourage peace. Because what a humanitarian state does, it replaces the government, it replaces the state. And by replacing the state, those humanitarian actors, what they tend to do is that people go more towards them than they go to the government. And that might, in some cases, be the seeds of instability. I know that it's just 1 minute, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to comment, but no time. I would like to comment the 3 items that you mentioned, but I will just comment, allow me, resilience. I think we need to debate and discuss the concept of resilience. Resilience is not to be poor and to be able not to die. No. It's not that concept of resilience. Resilience is to have the tools, education, learning, assets. When the external shock hits you, you keep walking. You keep walking. And the reason European young people, they are resilient because they have these tools. They have these tools. Ukrainian war has hit Europe, but they keep walking. In our case, when you don't provide society with these important assets for them to be resilient to external shocks, the external shocks comes, and we go back to our starting point. So nation building, completely in agreement. This is exactly the next call when you acknowledge the absence of the state as the root cause of conflict in Africa. The obvious conclusion, if this is the case, let's restart without no problems, not blaming the past, looking forward, but let's restart in the 21st century a state building process in Africa, completely aligned. Anyone would like to comment such an outstanding intervention from His Excellency Ambassador?
Yeah, no,
my hand is up. I think
Jide?
Victor, you are skipping me.
Is Jide? Who asked for the floor? Jide?
Yes.
Jide, please. He's talking? Jide? I don't, is only my problem or is everybody's problem?
No, it's he's not speaking.
Maybe he's muted. Jide, are you muted?
Hello.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I was waiting to be called. I am Landing Bisane, and I am
sorry,
the chairman.
It's another one, please. Okay.
This is Landing. My hands are up already.
Yeah.
Yes, please, go ahead. Be concise,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, actually I am Landing, and I am a chairman or mayor from Mansakonko in the Gambia. I have 2 questions with a comment. My question is, already we have existing structures or frameworks that we can utilize to promote and empower the young people of Africa. Talking about the Africa Youth Charter, this is a very important instrument that can be utilized and be developed on to respond to the needs of the young people of our continent. And how do we develop on that, or how do we utilize that as an opportunity for the young people of Africa? We have the Africa Youth Union, and we have other youth structures of the region. So how do we capitalize on the existence of those youth structures or youth instruments to promote youth empowerment in Africa. With regards to young people participation in political leadership, for me, I have the belief that the problem is not the young people, and it's not a matter of young people do not want to participate, but are they given the right opportunity and the right environment for them to partake in political leadership as far as our continent is concerned? When we have leaders who cling onto power continuously and do not want to leave. So the young people might not have the opportunity and may not have the energy to stay and wait for them. In Africa, we have a lot of leaders who have stayed for more than 30 years of a youth age. So obviously, the young people may not want to stay for 30 years to become leaders. So it's a matter of providing the opportunity and providing the right environment for young people to come and claim leadership and participate, but not only to be running and clapping and dancing behind political leaders. That is not their wish. They would also want to be leading. In fact, they can be leaders today and they can be leaders tomorrow as well.
Be concise, be concise.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me. I think this is a very good discussion point.
Yes,
and thank you, Iman.
Yes, thank
and
you for
Victor.
your contribution. Would like to comment to 1 second?
I'll
Iman?
into 1 second. I think you're making a point that links back to the previous question about resilience. So the way USG Duarte framed resilience as having the tools to withstand external shocks, what you mentioned about the legal framework on youth, I think it's a key area about basically youth on the continent being aware about those legal frameworks and their rights. So knowledge is key, right? And they, I think, often don't have the tools about what is being signed in Addis Ababa, sometimes what's being signed in their own countries, and the rights that they have and that they can claim in terms of political, economic rights and inclusion. So just in a nutshell, I think those frameworks exist, but how much are they aware that they exist? How much can they leverage those tools, claim those rights? How much are mechanisms in place for them to say, you know, they can go to their MPs, or they can, you know, they have some sort of, you know, grassroots structures in place that they can leverage. I think that's where the key issue is not that the frameworks don't exist, but more how can they leverage them in order to be resilient. So yeah, sorry, in 2 seconds.
And allow me to take the opportunity very quickly. This is a reason that in Module 1, and I hope we were clear. If not, we can improve for the next cohort of the online training course. We intentionally wanted to introduce the resilience concept and the resilience in this debate. Because when you introduce resilience in this conversation, at the end of the day, you are delivering a strong call to ownership. Because it's the only way. Is the only way. And now I think we can move to the chat for another question. We still have a couple of minutes.
Yes, we have a question on the funding gap that reads, how do we address the funding gap for sustainable development? We can have great policies and planning for implementation, but how do we ensure adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding for sustainable development to complement policy planning?
I have a great suggestion for this question. Can you wait Model 2 and 3? Please do not anticipate Model 2 and 3. Model 2 and 3 will be the models that will address this question. Because we have 4 pillars in this online training course. First, durable peace requires sustainable development. Second, sustainable development requires sustainable financing. Third, sustainable financing requires control over economic and financial flows. Fourth, control of economic and financial flows requires strong institutions, strong country systems, and governance frameworks. So allow me, please, come back to the webinar, to the second or third webinar, and we, after we deliver the model, and you will see that your question will be answered. With your permission, I would like to move to the next one in the chat, if possible.
Yes, there's one on practical steps that reads, What are the practical steps to be taken to bridge the gap or disconnect between interventionists, in brackets, Western world, their strategic interventions, and the actual beneficiaries of those interventions?
Now I'd like just to ask if Gide still being he left. Oh, Gide has left. Would like to take this question, Victor, very quickly.
Oh, yes. I think the interventionists and the beneficiaries, let's agree to the fact that aware of our need for peace in Africa, it remains still so tied up to our commitments to the wave of change that we are seeking in the continent. Where is the peace gain that we can count on our local potentials? To ensure a lasting peace and avoid these interventionists versus the beneficiaries crisis. I think it's important to know that the pace of the progress that we are pursuing, we can, metabolize and see out what is needed to weave together in the bigger picture. What is the local potential that we have at home that we can create our sustainable, reliant process of development financing at home. We don't need to be borrowing so much to develop. As a continent, there's so much that we can transform locally and then develop on our own, as opposed to whenever there's internal problem, we run out of the continent to look for money to borrow. And all this. That creates dependency syndrome, not only on individual, but also on our system. And that creates, an environment where we are not seen to be serious. So truly, whatever we're seeing, somebody talked about it earlier on, that when you see young people going to protest to the foreign embassies in our continent, it is painful because we know they are interveners. Yet I've never seen any African youth going to demonstrate in another African embassy in the continent. They all either go to Geneva, they go to Sweden, they go to American embassy. Well, because of that interventionist mindset, yet we have so much at home we can count on. So all we are seeing is a manifestation of an inner neglect, which is what we should have worked against.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much. Done. Any other question?
In the chat, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There is one on mindsets of the government in Africa that reads, what can be done to change the mindset of the government in Africa in growing homegrown policies that will be targeted towards achieving solutions to what's really on ground?
Who takes that?
I can also add a voice.
Yes, Victor.
The mindset question has been a comprehensive political failure or failure caused by political disillusionment with ideologies of liberation's arrogance. And somebody talked about leaders taking too long in power, enriching themselves and forgetting about all these defeats, they have this mindset of crush and kill my enemy. It really breaks hearts of the core of humanity that we regard as leaders, we regard our own people who are, uncomfortable with our way of leadership as enemies that we seek to crush them. So there's been a very big need for differentiation between liberation and occupation. Sometimes, somebody talked about it earlier on that, from the independence, the post-independent Africa, we had, so the liberators came and then occupiers came and took over. And, they started displacing everybody. So that has been a very mixed feeling of who actually came, who is liberated from this kind of leadership we're having today. So it's a political anomaly, which we are unable to address. We should work towards strengthening cooperation than confrontation. This would be my undertaking.
Yes, thank you very much. Iman?
I will just add one small point. I agree with everything that has been said. I just want to add the element of time in this discussion around, how to change mindsets of political leadership, bad governance, etc. in Africa, which is, somebody mentioned, the key issue of nation building. We mentioned social contracts in the discussion. I think sometimes we tend to be a bit harsh in how our expectations of the nation building process on the African continent. I tend to be quite optimistic as a person and think that it's underway because of the protests that we see, because of, the movements that we see, because of the agency. We've said it again and again, it's not an empty space. It has taken time. The current states that current form that the post-independence states are very young. They're less than a century young, you know. And for the quote-unquote liberal democracies that we see today, they've had time to develop. They've had their own cycles of, you know, bad governance, coups even. That's something that people forget, but coups, you know, happened in the West as well. France has been a big one. In any case, my point is, it's not to justify what we're currently seeing, but it's maybe to be a little bit more relative in terms of how much time it's going to take to have that change. I think that's why those kind of discussions are important, because they steer the way in the right direction, hopefully, for the people who actually have the power to put in place, you know, policies. But just to say that, you know, it's important to be indulgent a little, well, not of, you know, I don't want to seem undemocratic, but I think you got my point of saying time is an important factor to take into account in those discussions of, you know, in what pace are we going to see those mindsets change? I think the narrative is changing. That's from my standpoint. It needs to be, you know, repetition is key. You need to repeat it, including to the people who are on the ground. But I think, yeah, with time we can see some difference.
Thank you very much. 3 minutes, so allow me to underscore 2 or 3 ideas before closing this outstanding and exciting conversation. I do believe that, yes, our debate, our conversation succeeds in making a quite good contribution to the first pillar of the online training course. Durable peace requires sustainable development. Yeah. If this is the case, let's focus on sustainable development to try to deliver peace. And when discussing sustainable development, there were a couple of issues that were mentioned in this conversation. First, we need to be aware that, yes, Africa needs to acquire resilience using a more forward-looking approach. Without resilience, we'll not be able to deliver sustainable development. One. Second, we need, also in our conversation, I think was clear, the only way to build resilience and be ready to deliver, let's say, the SDGs, there is only one way to do it, by adopting people-centered policies. There is no other way. When you talk about bridges, roads, you name it, these interventions need to be driven by people-centered policies or governance frameworks that put people at the center. Third, as the ambassador mentioned, considering the past 6 years, considering the challenge today, we need to acknowledge with a forward-looking that, yes, we still have a nation building challenge, because resilience and people-centered policies need to be made in Africa, designed by Africans. Again, our conversation of institutional reforms, who should drive them to make them organic. And I stop here. I have 10 a.m. on my clock, and I would like to thank Victor, Jide, Eman, the participants, my team, and the staff college that together, I believe, we deliver an outstanding conversation and webinar in the Model 1 of OSAA's online training course. Peace and Development, the Nexus of Peace and Development, Governance, Finance, and Country Systems. Thank you very much. It has been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
The pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.